Jack Miller sat in his car, the engine idling as he watched the neon sign of a dimly lit bar flicker in the distance. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rumble of a truck passing by on the nearby highway. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the parking lot for anything unusual. This was his routine now, long hours spent waiting, watching, and hoping to catch someone doing something wrong. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all he had left. Jack had been a detective for nearly 20 years. In his younger days, he was known as one of the best. He solved cases others couldn't, put dangerous criminals behind bars, and earned respect from his peers. But lately things weren't going well for him. His clearance rate had dropped, and internal affairs had started, breathing down his neck. Complaints about excessive force and questionable tactics piled up, making him feel like he was under a microscope every time he stepped into the precinct. He knew why this was happening. The department was changing, and so were the rules. Jack's methods, once praised, were now seen as outdated and reckless. He didn't care much for politics or public relations. He just wanted to get the job done. But that attitude had cost him. Now, with pressure mounting, he needed a big win, something that would remind everyone why they hired him in the first place. The bar across the street was called the Rusty Nail. It wasn't anything special, just a dive where locals went to drink cheap beer and forget their troubles. But Jack had heard rumors. Word on the street was that it was a meeting spot for low-level drug dealers. If he could catch one of them red-handed, maybe even bust someone higher up the chain, it would be exactly the kind of victory he needed. As he sat there, sipping stale coffee from a thermos, a woman walked out of the bar. She wasn't dressed like the usual crowd, no leather jackets or ripped jeans. Instead, she wore a plain black coat and carried a small duffel bag. Her movements caught Jack's attention. She glanced over her shoulder nervously before heading toward a parked sedan. Something about her seemed off. Jack grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car. He adjusted his belt, making sure his badge was visible. As he approached the woman, he noticed she looked tired, almost worn out. Still, there was something sharp in her eyes, a hint of intelligence that made him pause. He introduced himself, flashing his badge. "Evening, ma'am. I'm Detective Miller. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" The woman turned to face him, her expression calm but cautious. "Sure," she said. "What's this about?" "I've been keeping an eye on this place," Jack replied, gesturing toward the bar. "We've had reports of illegal activity here. Just doing my job." She nodded slowly, though her body language suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I see. Well, I'm not involved in anything illegal, officer. I was just grabbing a drink after work." Jack studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. He asked for her ID and she handed it over without hesitation. Her name was Linda Harper. It didn't ring any bells, but Jack figured she could still be lying. After all, people who dealt drugs often used fake names. "Mind if I take a look inside your bag?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual. He already knew what he wanted to do next. If she refused, he'd have reasonable suspicion to search it anyway. And if she agreed, he'd find something, whether it was really there or not. Linda hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Go ahead," she said. "There's nothing in there except my gym clothes." Jack opened the bag carefully, pretending to inspect its contents. Inside, he found exactly what she'd described: a pair of sneakers, a towel, and some workout gear. Nothing incriminating. For a brief second, doubt crept into his mind. Maybe she really was telling the truth. But then he remembered the rumors, the pressure from his superiors, and the weight of his failing career. He couldn't afford to walk away empty-handed. Reaching into his pocket, Jack pulled out a small plastic bag containing white powder, a sample of cocaine confiscated during a previous arrest. He slipped it into Linda's duffel bag when she wasn't looking, then zipped it shut. When he turned back to face her, his expression was stern. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. We've got a problem here." Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you talking about? There's nothing in my bag." Jack shook his head, feigning disappointment. "I'm afraid we found narcotics in your possession. You'll have to explain this at the station. Her protests fell on deaf ears as Jack led her to his patrol car. As he drove her downtown, he felt a mix of relief and unease. On one hand, he finally had something concrete, a solid arrest that would prove he was still capable of doing his job. On the other hand, something about the whole situation felt wrong. Linda didn't act like a criminal. She didn't beg, or cry, or try to bribe him. She just stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched tightly. When they arrived at the station, Jack handed Linda over to the booking officer. He filled out the necessary paperwork, detailing how he'd discovered the drugs in her bag. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. That is, until the phone rang. It was Chief Daniels, his voice tense and urgent. "Jack, get in here. Now." Confused, Jack entered the chief's office to find two men in suits standing beside him. One of them introduced himself as Agent Roberts, from the DEA. The other remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest. Before Jack could ask what was going on, Agent Roberts spoke. "The woman you arrested tonight," he said. "Do you have any idea who she is?" Jack frowned. "Just some lady leaving a bar. Why?" Agent Roberts exchanged a glance with Chief Daniels before answering. "That lady happens to be Linda Harper, the newly appointed director of the Drug Enforcement Administration." Jack froze, his stomach sinking. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Her calm demeanor, her confidence, the way she hadn't panicked when confronted. She wasn't just some random person. He'd messed with the wrong individual. Big time. Chief Daniels slammed his hand on the desk. "What were you thinking, Jack? Planting evidence on the DEA director? Do you have any idea what this means for us? For you?" Jack opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. How could he explain? He'd acted out, of desperation, driven by fear of failure and a desire to prove himself. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the mess he'd created, and the consequences that were sure to follow. By morning, news of the botched arrest had spread like wildfire. Reporters swarmed the precinct, eager to get their hands on the story. Jack's colleagues avoided him, whisper were killing him with their silence. Suspended without pay, he returned home to find his apartment surrounded by cameras. His reputation, once solid, was now in shambles. As he sat alone in the dark, staring at the wall, Jack realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. But it was too late to undo it. The only question now was whether he could salvage anything from the wreckage, or if his career was truly over. The days following the arrest of Linda Harper felt like a never-ending storm for Jack Miller. Every morning he woke up to the sound of reporters shouting questions outside his apartment building. The media had turned his life into a circus, with headlines screaming about corruption in law enforcement and how a seasoned detective had stooped so low as to frame the DEA director. Jack tried to ignore it all, keeping the curtains drawn and avoiding stepping outside unless absolutely necessary. But no matter what he did, there was no escaping the weight of his mistake. At the precinct, things were even worse. His colleagues, who once respected him, or at least tolerated him, now treated him like a ghost. When Jack walked into the station, on Monday morning for a mandatory meeting with Internal Affairs, he could feel their eyes burning holes into his back. No one spoke to him. No one even looked directly at him. It was as if he'd become invisible, erased from the team he'd spent 2 decades serving. The meeting itself was brutal. Chief Daniels sat at the head of the table, his face grim. Across from him were 2 representatives from Internal Affairs, both armed with thick folders filled with evidence against Jack. They went through every detail of the incident, how Jack had stopped Linda Harper without probable cause, how the drugs found in her bag didn't match any records of recent seizures, and how surveillance footage showed Jack tampering with her belongings during the search. Jack listened silently, his hands clenched into fists under the table. He wanted to argue, to explain that he wasn't corrupt, that he'd just made a terrible decision under pressure. But deep down, he knew they wouldn't believe him. Even if they did, it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. When the meeting ended, Chief Daniels pulled Jack aside. His voice was low but firm. "You're suspended indefinitely, Jack, without pay. And depending on how this plays out, you might be looking at criminal charges. I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done." Jack nodded numbly. There was nothing left to say. As he left the room, he caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. For the first time in years, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He looked defeated. Outside the station, the reporters were still waiting. Cameras flashed as Jack pushed past them, ignoring their questions. One particularly persistent journalist shouted, "Detective Miller, do you regret ruining your career over this?" Jack froze for a moment, then kept walking. Regret? Of course he regretted it, but admitting that wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't undo the mess he'd created or restore the trust he'd lost. Back at home, Jack poured himself a drink and sat on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV. Every news station seemed to be covering the scandal. Some commentators praised Linda Harper for her grace and professionalism in handling the situation, while others criticized her for being too soft on Jack. A few conspiracy theorists speculated that the whole thing was staged, a publicity stunt, designed to highlight systemic issues within law enforcement. Jack scoffed at that idea. If only it were that simple. Amidst all the chaos, Linda Harper released a statement. It was short and measured, emphasizing her belief in reform rather than revenge. She acknowledged the seriousness of Jack's actions, but expressed hope that this incident would spark meaningful conversations about accountability and integrity in policing. Jack read the statement multiple times, searching for hidden meaning between the lines. Was she trying to send him a message? Or was she genuinely willing to move past this? Despite her words, Jack knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. His suspension meant no income, and the legal fees were already piling up. Friends and family stopped calling, unsure of what to say or afraid of being associated with him. Even his landlord hinted at eviction if Jack couldn't come up with next month's rent. Isolation crept in, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. One evening, unable to stand being cooped up in his apartment any longer, Jack decided to take a walk. He wandered aimlessly through the city streets, his hood pulled up to avoid recognition. The air was cool and the streets were quiet, except for the occasional car driving by. As he passed a small park, he noticed a group of teenagers gathered near a bench. They laughed and joked, seemingly oblivious to the world around them. Watching them, Jack felt a pang of envy. Their lives were uncomplicated, free from the burdens of responsibility and regret that weighed so heavily on him. He continued walking, until he reached a familiar corner store. Back when he was still active on the force, this place used to be one of his regular stops during late-night patrols. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Patel, always greeted him warmly and offered a cup of tea. Now as Jack stepped inside, Mr. Patel barely glanced up from behind the counter. "Evening," Jack said awkwardly, picking up a bottle of water. Mr. Patel nodded curtly, ringing up the purchase without saying a word. Jack handed over the money and left quickly, feeling the sting of rejection. It was clear that even people who had once trusted him now saw him differently. That night, lying awake in bed, Jack replayed the events leading up to his downfall over and over again in his mind. He thought about the rumors he'd heard about, the rusty nail, and how desperate he'd been to prove himself. He thought about Linda Harper, the look of shock on her face when he accused her of carrying drugs. Most of all, he thought about how far he'd fallen. From celebrated detective to disgraced cop in less than a week. How had it happened so fast? Somewhere in the haze of self-pity and regret, a small voice whispered in the back of his mind. What if this wasn't the end? What if, despite everything, he still had a chance to make things right? It was a faint hope, barely flickering in the darkness. But it was enough to keep him going. Over the next few days, Jack began piecing together fragments of information about Linda Harper. He scoured newspapers, online articles, and social media posts, learning everything he could about her background. She came from humble beginnings, raised by a single mother in a working-class neighborhood. She worked her way through college, earning degrees in criminal justice and public policy before joining the DEA. Her rise to director was meteoric, fueled by a reputation for honesty and dedication to the fight against drug trafficking. As Jack delved deeper into her story, he started to see her not just as the woman he'd wronged, but as someone who truly cared about making a difference. Maybe that was why she hadn't pressed charges or demanded his immediate termination. Maybe she saw potential in him, even after everything. Inspired by this newfound perspective, Jack decided to write her a letter. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. Instead, it was an acknowledgement of his mistakes and a promise to do better. He poured his heart into the words, explaining how fear and desperation had clouded his judgment. He admitted that he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped she might consider giving him another chance to contribute positively to the community. After finishing the letter, Jack hesitated. Sending it felt like taking a leap of faith, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. But ultimately, he sealed the envelope and mailed it anyway. Whether Linda Harper responded or not, he realized, didn't matter as much as the act of reaching out itself. It was a step toward redemption, however small. In the weeks that followed, Jack tried to stay busy. He cleaned his apartment, reorganized his shelves, and even started jogging again, a habit he'd abandoned years ago. Slowly but surely, he began clawing his way out of the pit of despair he'd fallen into. The guilt was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. But alongside it, something else began to grow. Determination. Determination to rebuild his life, to prove that he was more than the sum of his mistakes. Then, one afternoon, as Jack returned from a run, he found an envelope tucked under his door. His heart raced as he picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a handwritten note from Linda Harper. It was brief, but powerful. Detective Miller, your letter gave me much to think about. While I cannot condone your actions, I appreciate your honesty and willingness to confront them. Perhaps there is a path forward for both of us, one where we can work together to address the challenges facing our communities. Let's talk soon. Sincerely, Linda Harper. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to smile. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. Jack Miller couldn't stop staring at the note from Linda Harper. He read it over and over, each word sinking deeper into his mind. It wasn't an apology or a promise of redemption, but it was something far more valuable. A chance. A chance to prove himself, to show that he wasn't the man who had planted drugs on her, but someone capable of doing the right thing. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a flicker of hope. He decided to take action immediately. The next morning, he dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made him look presentable without being too formal. He wanted to appear respectful but not desperate. Before leaving, he rehearsed what he would say to Linda Harper if she agreed to meet with him. He imagined every possible scenario, her anger, her disappointment, even her outright rejection, but none of those thoughts stopped him. He owed it to himself to try. Jack called the DEA office and requested a meeting with Linda Harper. To his surprise, her assistant didn't hesitate to schedule one for later that week. When the day arrived, Jack arrived early, pacing nervously, outside the building until it was time to go in. The lobby was sleek and modern, filled with polished marble floors and quiet professionals typing away on laptops. Jack felt out of place, like a shadow lingering in a world he no longer belonged to. When he finally entered Linda Harper's office, she greeted him with a calm but guarded expression. She gestured for him to sit, then leaned back in her chair, studying him intently. Jack swallowed hard, his palms sweaty as he tried to find the right words. "Director Harper," he began, his voice shaky at first but growing steadier as he spoke. "I want to thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I don't deserve your time after what I've done, but I'm here because I need to make things right, not just for myself, but for everyone affected by my actions." Linda listened silently, her face unreadable. When Jack finished speaking, she nodded slowly. "Detective Miller," she said, her tone measured, "your letter meant a lot to me. It showed that you're willing to acknowledge your mistakes, which is rare these days. But acknowledgement isn't enough. Actions matter more than words. Jack nodded vigorously. I understand that, Director Harper, and I'm ready to act. If there's any way I can help, if there's anything I can do to contribute to your work, I'll do it, no questions asked. Linda studied him for a moment longer before leaning forward slightly. There might be something, she said, but it won't be easy, and it will require complete honesty and cooperation from you. Jack felt his heart race. Anything, he said firmly. Just tell me what needs to be done. Linda explained that the DEA had been tracking a major drug trafficking operation linked to a powerful criminal named Victor Kane. Kane was known for smuggling large quantities of synthetic opioids into the country, and his network stretched across multiple states. Despite numerous investigations, they hadn't been able to gather enough evidence to bring him down. What they needed most was someone who could navigate the streets, someone who knew how criminals operated. I'm not asking you to go undercover, Linda clarified. You're too well known for that, but your experience could still be useful. If you're willing to share information about the people and places you've encountered during your career, it might help us build a stronger case against Kane. Jack hesitated for only a second before nodding. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. Just give me a list of what you need and I'll get started. Over the next few days, Jack threw himself into the task. He spent hours reviewing old case files, jotting down names and locations that might be connected to Kane's operation. He reached out to former colleagues, cautiously asking for updates on suspects he'd arrested years ago. Some were reluctant to talk to him, given his current status, but others were willing to share what they knew. Slowly but surely, Jack began piecing together a map of Kane's network. One evening, while going through a stack of notes, Jack stumbled upon a name that caught his attention. Alex Rivera. Rivera was a mid-level dealer Jack had arrested a decade earlier. At the time, Rivera had claimed he was working under orders from someone higher up, but Jack hadn't been able to verify those claims. Now looking back, Jack wondered if Rivera might have been telling the truth, and if so, whether he could lead them to Kane. The problem was that Rivera was currently serving time in a federal penitentiary. Getting access to him wouldn't be easy, especially given Jack's suspension. Still, Jack decided to pursue the lead. He contacted Linda Harper, explaining his theory and requesting permission to visit Rivera in prison. To his relief, she agreed, arranging for Jack to speak with Rivera under the supervision of DEA agents. When Jack arrived at the penitentiary, he felt a strange mix of nerves and excitement. He hadn't stepped foot in a prison since his early days as a detective, and the sterile, oppressive atmosphere hit him like a punch to the gut. Rivera was brought into the visiting room in handcuffs, his face lined with age and bitterness. When he saw Jack, his eyes narrowed, suspicious. Much did you know? Rivera shrugged, feigning indifference. Depends. What's in it for me? Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice. If you cooperate, I'll put in a good word with the parole board, maybe even get your sentence reduced. But if you waste my time, I'll make sure you rot in here. Rivera smirked but didn't argue. After a moment, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. Fine, he said. What do you want to know? For the next hour, Jack grilled Rivera about Kane's operation. At first, Rivera was evasive, offering vague answers and half-truths, but as Jack pressed harder, Rivera began opening up. He confirmed that Kane was indeed behind several high-profile drug shipments and provided details about key players in the organization. By the end of the conversation, Jack had a clearer picture of how Kane's network functioned and where its weaknesses might lie. When he left the prison, Jack felt a surge of optimism. For the first time in months, he felt like he was making progress, not just toward redeeming himself, but toward taking down someone who truly deserved it. He called Linda Harper immediately, updating her on everything he'd learned. She thanked him and promised to pass the information along to her team. As the days turned into weeks, Jack continued working tirelessly. He followed up on leads, cross-referenced data, and collaborated with DEA analysts to identify patterns in Kane's activities. Though he wasn't officially part of the investigation, his contributions proved invaluable. Slowly but surely, Jack began earning back a sliver of respect, not just from Linda Harper but also from himself. Still, the road ahead was long and uncertain. Taking down someone like Victor Kane wouldn't be easy, and there were bound to be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he had purpose again. He wasn't just trying to fix his own life. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. And that thought gave him strength. One night, as Jack sat alone in his apartment reviewing notes spread across his kitchen table, he allowed himself a small smile. The weight of his past mistakes still lingered, but it no longer felt unbearable. He was moving forward, one step at a time. Jack Miller's days began to blur together as he dove deeper into the investigation against Victor Kane. Every morning, he woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and spread his notes across the kitchen table. The walls of his apartment were covered in scribbled maps, photographs, and timelines connecting dots between Kane's associates and their operations. It was messy work, but Jack didn't mind. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a mission worth fighting for. The DEA team, led by Linda Harper, relied heavily on Jack's insights. His street-level knowledge filled gaps that their high-tech surveillance couldn't touch. He pointed out patterns in Kane's behavior, how he used low-level dealers as pawns, how he laundered money through legitimate businesses, and how he always stayed one step ahead of law enforcement. Jack's input helped them narrow down locations where Kane might be storing drugs or meeting with suppliers. But as the investigation progressed, Jack started noticing something unsettling. Some of the names and connections he uncovered weren't just tied to Kane. They also linked back to people within the police department. Former colleagues, supervisors, and even a few city officials appeared to have ties to Kane's network. At first, Jack dismissed it as paranoia. Maybe these individuals were being framed or falsely implicated. But the more evidence he gathered, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Corruption ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. One afternoon, while reviewing financial records provided by the DEA, Jack stumbled upon a transaction that made his blood run cold. A large sum of money had been transferred from a shell company linked to Kane to an account belonging to Chief Daniels, the same man who had suspended Jack after the botched arrest of Linda Harper. Jack stared at the screen, his hands trembling, slightly. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal empire anymore, it was about exposing the rot within his own organization. He called Linda Harper immediately. When she answered, her tone was calm but firm. "What is it, Jack?" she asked. "I think we've got a bigger problem," Jack replied, his voice low. "It's not just Kane. There are people inside the department helping him, high-ranking people." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Linda spoke again. "Are you sure about this?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't," Jack said. "I found proof. Chief Daniels is involved." Linda sighed, her frustration evident. "This complicates things. If word gets out that we're looking into internal corruption, it could blow up in our faces. We need to tread carefully." "I understand," Jack said, "but we can't ignore it either. If we want to take Kane down for good, we have to cut off his support system, including whoever's protecting him." After a long silence, Linda agreed. "All right, keep digging, but don't act alone. Let me handle the political side of this. You focus on gathering evidence." Meanwhile, Jack's growing involvement in the case caught the attention of someone else. Emily Dawson, a rookie journalist determined to make a name for herself. Emily had been following the scandal surrounding Jack's suspension closely, writing articles that questioned systemic issues within law enforcement. She saw potential in Jack's story, not just as a cautionary tale about corruption, but as a chance to highlight broader problems plaguing the justice system. One evening, while Jack was grabbing dinner at a diner near his apartment, Emily approached him. She slid into the booth across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Detective Miller," she said with a confident smile, "we need to talk." Jack frowned, recognizing her instantly. "Miss Dawson," he said cautiously, "I'm not interested in interviews." "It's not about an interview," Emily replied. "Well, not yet anyway. I know you're working with the DEA now, and I know you're trying to redeem yourself. What I want to know is why." Jack hesitated. He hadn't expected anyone outside the DEA to figure out what he was doing. How do you know all this? He asked. I have my sources, Emily said with a shrug. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just think your story could inspire change, if told the right way. People need to see that even someone who's made mistakes can still fight for what's right. Jack leaned back in his seat, studying her face. Emily was young, maybe in her mid-20s, with sharp eyes and an air of determination. She reminded him of himself when he first joined the force, idealistic and eager to make a difference. Still, trusting her felt risky. Why should I believe you won't twist my words or use me for a headline? Jack asked. Emily held his gaze. Because I care about the truth, and because I think we can help each other. You give me access to your side of the story, and I'll keep your secrets until the time is right. Jack thought about it for a moment. Having someone like Emily on his side could be useful. She had resources and connections he didn't, and her reporting might shine a light on the corruption they were uncovering. Finally, he nodded. Fine, but if you betray me, I'll walk away from everything, including this conversation. Emily smiled. Deal. Over the next few weeks, Jack and Emily formed an uneasy alliance. They met regularly, sharing information and strategizing about how to expose Kane's operation without tipping off the corrupt officials protecting him. Emily dug into public records, uncovering additional links between Kane and local politicians. Meanwhile, Jack continued feeding the DEA actionable intelligence, ensuring they stayed one step ahead of their target. Their partnership wasn't without tension. Emily often pushed Jack to reveal more than he was comfortable with, while Jack grew frustrated with her tendency to prioritize headlines over safety. But despite their differences, they respected each other's dedication to the cause. Together, they uncovered crucial details about Kane's upcoming shipment, a massive delivery of synthetic opioids scheduled to arrive at the docks in less than a week. This is it, Jack said during one of their late-night meetings. If we can intercept this shipment, we'll have enough evidence to bring Kane down, and everyone working with him. Emily nodded, her excitement tempered by caution. We'll need to move fast. Once Kane realizes we're onto him, he'll disappear. Jack agreed. He contacted Linda Harper, updating her on their findings and coordinating plans for the raid. The DEA assembled a task force, preparing to strike at dawn on the day of the delivery. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But as the hours ticked by, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His instincts, honed by years on the job, screamed at him to double-check every detail. He reviewed the plans obsessively, searching for flaws. That's when he noticed it. One of the officers assigned to the task force was listed as having worked closely with Chief Daniels. Jack's stomach sank. If Daniels was involved, there was a good chance this officer would tip off Kane. Jack called Linda Harper immediately. We have a leak, he said. Someone on the task force is compromised. Linda cursed under her breath. Are you certain? As certain as I can be, Jack replied. We need to change our approach, fast. They decided to split the operation into two parts. The DEA would proceed with the original plan, creating a diversion to draw Kane's attention. Meanwhile, Jack and Emily would stake out the docks themselves, watching for any signs of betrayal. It was a risky move, but they didn't have a choice. On the night of the raid, Jack and Emily positioned themselves in an abandoned warehouse overlooking the dockyard. Armed with binoculars and a radio tuned to the DEA's frequency, they waited silently as the clock ticked closer to dawn. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the darkness. Suddenly, Emily grabbed Jack's arm. Look, she whispered, pointing toward the water. A boat was approaching the dock, its lights dimmed to avoid detection. Men began unloading crates onto trucks, moving quickly and efficiently. Jack adjusted his binoculars, scanning the scene. Then he spotted him, Victor Kane, standing near the edge of the pier, barking orders at his men. It was the first time Jack had seen him in person. The man exuded authority, his presence commanding respect even from a distance. Just as Jack reached for his radio to alert the DEA, headlights pierced the darkness. A A convoy of vehicles roared into view, cutting off the escape route. The DEA team had arrived. Chaos erupted as agents swarmed the area, shouting commands and firing warning shots. Kane's men scattered, abandoning the crates and fleeing into the shadows. For a moment, it looked like the operation was succeeding. But then Jack noticed something alarming. One of the trucks carrying the drugs reversed course, heading straight for a hidden exit. Someone had tipped them off. "We need to stop that truck," Jack shouted, grabbing his gun. Emily hesitated. "Are you crazy? We're outnumbered." "There's no time to argue," Jack snapped. "Stay here if you want, but I'm not letting them get away." Without waiting for a response, Jack sprinted toward the truck, his heart pounding in his chest. As he closed the distance, he fired a warning shot, aiming for the tires. The driver swerved, trying to evade him, but Jack kept running, adrenaline fueling his every step. Behind him, Emily cursed loudly before following. She knew she couldn't let Jack go alone, not when they were so close to finishing what they'd started. As the truck screeched to a halt near the exit, Jack tackled the driver to the ground, pinning him down with surprising strength. Emily arrived moments later, her hands shaking as she pointed her flashlight at the scene. The aftermath of the raid at the docks was chaos. DEA agents swarmed the area, securing evidence and rounding up suspects. Victor Kane, however, managed to slip away in the confusion, disappearing into the night like smoke. Jack stood near the abandoned truck, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. His hands were scraped raw from tackling the driver, and his clothes were streaked with dirt. But none of that mattered. The crates of synthetic opioids had been seized, cutting off a major artery in Kane's operation. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was progress. Emily approached him cautiously, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack nodded, though his expression remained grim. "I'm fine," he said, "but Kane got away." "We'll find him," Emily replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "This is still a huge win. You did what everyone thought was impossible." Jack didn't respond. He knew Emily was right, this was a step forward, but it didn't feel like enough. Every second Kane remained free meant more lives destroyed by his drugs. And worse, every moment gave Kane's allies within the police department and city government time to cover their tracks. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack and Emily were approached by Linda Harper. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene before settling on Jack. "Good work," she said simply, her tone measured but sincere. "You saved this operation tonight." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "We're not done yet," he muttered. "Kane's still out there, and so are the people protecting him." Linda nodded. "I know, but we've made a dent. That's something." She handed Jack a folder containing preliminary reports about the raid. Inside were lists of names, people, tied to the shipment who had been arrested or identified during the operation. As Jack flipped through the pages, one name jumped out at him: Detective Marcus Hale. Hale was a senior officer at the precinct, someone Jack had worked alongside for years. Seeing his name listed among Kane's associates hit Jack like a punch to the gut. "They're everywhere," Jack said bitterly, closing the folder. "Everywhere we look, they're already there." Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. "Which is why we need to be smarter than them. This isn't just about taking down Kane anymore. It's about dismantling the entire network. We'll get justice, Jack, for everyone." Over the next few days, Jack threw himself into the investigation with renewed intensity. He spent hours reviewing interrogation transcripts, analyzing phone records, and cross-referencing financial transactions. The DEA team worked tirelessly alongside him, piecing together the puzzle of Kane's empire. Meanwhile, Emily continued her own research, publishing articles that exposed the corruption without revealing too much about the ongoing investigation. Her reporting sparked public outrage, putting pressure on city officials to take action. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. Jack started receiving anonymous threats, messages left on his voicemail warning him to back off. One night as he returned home, he noticed someone watching him from a parked car across the street. When he confronted them, The car sped away. Leaving behind only tire marks and a sinking sense of dread, Emily urged him to be careful. "These people aren't playing games, Jack," she warned. "If they think you're getting too close, they won't hesitate to hurt you or anyone else involved." "I know," Jack replied, his jaw tightening. "But I can't stop now. Not when we're this close." Despite the risks, Jack refused to slow down. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, not just for him but for the countless lives affected by Kane's drugs. Every lead mattered, no matter how small. And then, one evening, he found something that changed everything. While combing through surveillance footage from the dockyard, Jack spotted a familiar face. It was Detective Marcus Hale, standing in the shadows as the shipment was unloaded. Hale hadn't been directly involved in the physical labor, but his presence confirmed what Jack had suspected all along. Kane's influence reached deep into the police department. Worse, Hale wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Chief Daniels, the man who had suspended Jack and tried to bury the scandal surrounding Linda Harper. Jack's blood boiled as he rewound the footage, confirming what he'd seen. There was no denying it now. The very people tasked with protecting the city were complicit in its destruction. He called Linda Harper immediately, explaining what he'd discovered. "This is bigger than Kane," Jack said, his voice shaking with anger. "We're talking about systematic corruption. If we don't expose it, nothing will change." Linda listened carefully, her expression unreadable. "You're right," she said finally. "But going after them won't be easy. They have power, resources, and connections we can't match." "Then we fight smarter," Jack insisted. "We gather undeniable proof and make sure it gets to the right people. The media, federal agencies, anyone who can help us take them down." Linda agreed, but she warned Jack to stay vigilant. "They'll come after you if they realize what you're planning," she said. "Be ready." As the days passed, Jack and Emily devised a plan to document the corruption thoroughly. They compiled evidence linking Chief Daniels, Detective Hale, and several other officials to Kane's operation. Phone calls, bank transfers, and even text messages painted a damning picture of collusion and greed. With each new piece of evidence, Jack felt a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. These weren't just criminals, they were supposed to be guardians of the law. But their efforts didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, while meeting with Emily in a secluded park to exchange files, they were ambushed. A black SUV skidded to a halt nearby, and two men jumped out, their faces obscured by masks. Without hesitation, they lunged toward Jack and Emily, grabbing at the folders in their hands. "Run!" Jack shouted, shoving Emily toward the trees. She hesitated for a split second before sprinting away, clutching the evidence tightly to her chest. Jack stayed behind, buying her time by engaging the attackers. Though outnumbered, he fought fiercely, landing punches and kicks wherever he could. But the men were trained fighters, and it wasn't long before they gained the upper hand. One of them grabbed Jack by the collar, slamming him against a tree. "You should have stayed out of this," the man growled, raising a fist. Just as he was about to strike, a loud whistle pierced the air. Emily had circled back, holding a heavy branch like a weapon. Before the attacker could react, she swung it with all her strength, hitting him squarely in the head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The second man turned to face her, but Jack seized the opportunity to tackle him from behind. Together, they subdued him, tying his hands with a belt before calling the police. By the time backup arrived, both assailants were secured, and the evidence was safely in Emily's possession. "You saved me," Jack said later, wincing as he applied ice to a bruised rib. "I owe you one." Emily shook her head, her hands still trembling. "We're a team, remember? Besides, you would have done the same for me." That night, Jack and Emily delivered the evidence to Linda Harper. She reviewed it carefully, her expression growing darker with each page. "This is enough," she said finally. "More than enough. I'll make sure it reaches the Attorney General's office first thing tomorrow morning." "What happens next?" Jack asked. Linda sighed, running a hand through her hair. "There will be arrests, investigations, trials. It won't be quick or easy, but it's a start." Jack nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. Taking down corrupt officials meant challenging. Powerful interests and retaliation was almost inevitable. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that justice might actually prevail. As he left the DEA office, Emily walked beside him, her steps lighter than usual. "You know," she said with a small smile, "you're not the same guy I met a few weeks ago." Jack glanced at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You've changed," she said. "You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for something bigger." Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked up at the night sky, thinking about everything that had happened, and everything that still lay ahead. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe this ordeal had changed him, or maybe it had simply reminded him of who he used to be. Whatever the case, one thing was certain. Jack Miller wasn't giving up, not now, not ever. The days following the delivery of evidence to Linda Harper felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. Jack Miller and Emily Dawson knew they had set something massive in motion, but the calm before the chaos was unnerving. Every phone call, every knock at the door made them tense, wondering if it was someone coming to silence them for good. Yet, despite the fear, neither of them backed down. They had come too far to turn back now. The first wave of arrests hit the city like a thunderclap. Early one morning, federal agents swept through the police department, hauling away Chief Daniels, Detective Marcus Hale, and several other high-ranking officials. News outlets exploded with headlines about corruption within law enforcement, and public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protesters gathered outside City Hall demanding accountability and reform. For Jack, watching the fallout unfold was surreal. These were people he'd worked alongside for years, men and women he had once trusted. Now their names were synonymous with betrayal. But as satisfying as it was to see justice served, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still ahead. Victor Kane remained at large, and his network was vast. Even with key players behind bars, there were others waiting in the shadows, ready to pick up where Kane's allies had left off. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Linda Harper called Jack into her office a few days later. Her expression was serious, though there was a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "You've done incredible work, Jack," she said. "But I need you to keep going. We're closing in on Kane, and we can't afford any missteps now." Jack nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What do you need me to do?" "We've tracked Kane to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town," Linda explained. "He's planning another shipment, bigger than the last one. If we can intercept it, we might finally have enough leverage to bring him down for good. But this is dangerous. He'll be expecting us." "I'm not afraid of danger," Jack replied firmly. "Tell me when and where." Linda hesitated for a moment, then handed him a folder containing detailed plans for the operation. "We move tomorrow night. Be ready." That evening, Jack met with Emily to go over the details. She listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "This sounds risky," she said. "Are you sure you should be doing this alone? What if something goes wrong?" "I won't be alone," Jack assured her. "The DEA will be there, and so will backup. But I need you to stay safe. If anything happens to me, make sure the story gets out. Promise me that." Emily opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. Instead, she nodded solemnly. "I promise." The next night, Jack joined a team of DEA agents at a staging area near the warehouse. The air was thick with tension as they reviewed the plan one last time. Jack's role was clear. He would lead a small group inside to locate Kane, while the rest of the team secured the perimeter. It was a risky maneuver, but Jack knew the layout of places like this better than anyone else. As they approached the warehouse under cover of darkness, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He moved cautiously, his gun drawn, scanning every corner for signs of movement. Inside, the space was dimly lit, filled with crates stacked haphazardly. The smell of chemicals hung heavy in the air. Jack signaled for his team to spread out, keeping their movements quiet and deliberate. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building. Gunfire erupted from the far end of the warehouse. Jack froze for a moment, realizing it was a distraction, a tactic to draw them away. He signaled for his team to hold their position and pressed forward, ignoring the noise. He knew Kane wouldn't be near the gunfire. He'd be hiding, waiting for the right moment to escape. After several tense minutes, they reached a locked door at the back of the warehouse. Jack motioned for one of the agents to pick the lock, and within seconds, they were inside. The room was small and cluttered, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. In the center stood Victor Kane, surrounded by stacks of cash and documents. His face was calm, almost smug, as if he'd been expecting them. "Detective Miller," Kane said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Took you long enough." "It's over, Kane," Jack replied, leveling his gun at the man. "You're under arrest." Kane chuckled darkly. "Do you really think arresting me will fix anything? This system is rotten to the core. Take me out and someone else will take my place." Jack tightened his grip on the weapon. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. Today we take you down. Tomorrow we clean up the mess." Kane's smirk faded, replaced by a cold fury. Without warning, he lunged for a device on the table, a detonator. Jack reacted instantly, firing a shot that grazed Kane's arm and sent the detonator clattering to the floor. Kane cursed in pain, clutching his wound as two agents rushed in to restrain him. "Clear the building," Jack shouted, remembering. The chemicals stored nearby. "Now!" The team didn't hesitate. They dragged Kane out of the room and regrouped outside, just as an explosion rocked the warehouse. Flames engulfed the structure, lighting up the night sky. Jack watched silently, his mind racing. It was over. Kane was captured, and his operation was destroyed. In the days that followed, the city began to heal. Federal investigators combed through the wreckage of the warehouse, uncovering even more evidence of Kane's crimes. Public pressure mounted for sweeping reforms within law enforcement, and Linda Harper announced a series of initiatives aimed at rooting out corruption and rebuilding trust with the community. Jack, meanwhile, found himself at a crossroads. With Kane behind bars and the investigation winding down, he realized he no longer fit into the world of traditional policing. Too much had changed, not just the department, but him. He decided to step away from active duty and accept Linda's offer to become a civilian consultant. His new role involved training young officers, sharing lessons learned from his mistakes, and helping shape a new generation of law enforcement professionals. Emily published her final article on the case, detailing the full scope of the corruption and the efforts to bring Kane and his allies to justice. The piece received widespread acclaim, earning her recognition as a fearless journalist committed to exposing the truth. Though proud of her work, Emily knew it was only the beginning. There were still stories to tell, injustices to uncover, and systems to hold accountable. Months later, Jack sat on a park bench watching children play on the swings. The sun was warm on his face, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. He thought about everything he'd been through, the mistakes, the redemption, the sacrifices, and realized it had all led him here, to a place where he could start over, not as the man who had planted drugs on the DEA director, but as someone who had fought to make things right. Linda Harper joined him on the bench, holding 2 cups of coffee. "How are you holding up?" she asked, handing him one of the cups. "I'm okay," Jack replied, taking a sip. "Better than I expected, actually. It feels good to be doing something meaningful again." Linda smiled. "You earned this, Jack. Don't forget that." Jack shook his head. "No, I didn't earn it. I screwed up big time. But you gave me a second chance, and I'm not going to waste it." They sat in silence for a while, enjoying the quiet. Finally, Linda spoke. "You know, the fight isn't over. There will always be people like Kane, always be systems that need fixing. But because of what you've done, we're closer to a better future." Jack nodded. "Yeah, and maybe that's enough for now." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in golden light, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had faced his demons, paid his dues, and emerged stronger. Whatever came next, he would meet it head-on, armed with the knowledge that even the smallest actions could spark change.